Recombination Nation. Today, an experiment, my first solo episode, and I wanted to make this a unscripted but researched deep dive into the potential domestication of the beaver. So I'm figuring this out as I go. So let's just try and make this interesting, and let's delve into the possibilities and potential with domesticating beavers as a new species to add to the human family. So first, let's have a look at beaver genetics. There are two species of beaver alive today. The first is the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber. It was nearly hunted to extinction in the 1900s, going as low as 1,200 animals, according to estimates. That left 8 genetically bottlenecked populations throughout mainland Europe. I think there's one in Scotland as well. And restoration programs have been swapping animals between those populations to restore genetic diversity to local populations. Central Europe seems to have the best recovery. There's been 4 main remnant sites that have been interchanging material. Further afield, there is the Mongolian or Chinese beaver population that is highly distinct but also very highly inbred. That's a Castor fiber buruli. And there are also a population of Siberian beavers that have shown the highest immune system genetic diversity. So there's a bit in the mix, but a very heavily impacted species. On the other side of the ocean, the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, was hunted down to around 100,000 animals in the 1900s, but it's since bounced back by about 100-fold in numbers with the rollout of hunting bans, but there hasn't been much in the way of deliberate translocation of animals between different regions. And since they went through a smaller bottleneck, there's more genetic diversity that has been retained across their range. There is a population, a subspecies Mexicanus, that is still endangered and has fairly different genetics. And an interesting natural experiment happened when 50 animals were introduced to the bottom tip of South America at Tierra del Fuego, which has since expanded to 100,000 animals and is now being managed as an invasive species. It's also worth noting that American beavers were introduced into Europe and have naturalized in a few places. So the next section, hybridization potential. So Eurasian beavers have 48 chromosomes, while the Americans have 40. The Russians attempted hybridization in captivity. One mating gave one stillborn kit out of, I think, 27 attempts. So this has led to mainstream researchers believing that they are genetically incompatible, but our friend Eugene McCarthy at macroevolution.net has a page on beaver hybridization, and he argues that many mammals with similar chromosomal mismatches were initially thought to be incompatible, but eventually produced viable and even fertile offspring. And there is also a field report in Austria where the European and the American beavers overlap in their range, and 3 individuals with intermediate traits were observed, but they were dismissed as not being hybrids because everybody knows that's not possible. So yeah, there is a hint that hybridization will be possible, but given the diversity remaining in both of the surviving species, domestication should be possible without hybridization. It shouldn't be absolutely essential, but it's worth continuing investigations to see if it's possible. Looking at beaver reproductive behavior, the animals mature in 2 to 3 years, as early as 1.5 years in rare occasions. They produce 1 litter per year in the winter, with around 100 to 128 day gestation, producing 1 to 8 offspring called kits. Their reproductive behavior involves forming a strongly monogamous pair, though they do occasionally mate on the side. I think American beavers are more prone to that, but under the right circumstances, that could probably be manipulated. The young tend to stay in the family lodge until they are 2 years old and assist with building the dam and building the lodge, and then they disperse into the wider environment to take their chances and form new pairs. And on this basis, you could expect a domestication program to take probably a couple of decades to go through the initial generations. When it comes to captive breeding, it's not straightforward. Animals need access to large bodies of water to induce breeding, and their urge to engineer dams is powerful, so that can make creating housing, cages for them in captivity, relatively challenging because they will try to manipulate anything that they can get their hands and their teeth onto. You also have an issue of aggression between families and from parents to their mature children once they reach the stage that they would normally disperse. And an intensive or industrial-styled control breeding program in a single specialized facility is unlikely to be feasible. Instead, I would recommend a distributed approach with one beaver family at a time per watershed spread across the landscape, and then create a network of selective breeders looking at their animals to develop traits that they collectively are looking for. This is called an open nucleus breeding program. And currently, this could be built on top of an existing program for restoring wild beavers in the USA, where they trap wild animals, quarantine them temporarily in facilities to reduce the risk of introducing diseases into the new locations, and then relocate those animals to vacant habitats where they have a chance to build their own lodge and dam. And yeah, they tend to mix and match individuals from different locations to reduce inbreeding depression. So this comes with an immediate incentive of ecosystem restoration. The recreation of beaver dams in the ecosystem improves the hydrology of the locations. It creates open water for other species. So a lot of people are already doing this. In the short term, this kind of a program would be selecting for animals that are easier to handle. So this is called flight distance from humans, and this is a trait that you could be used to select individual animals from litters or from maybe from wild animals that are being selected for relocation into other locations. This technique was used in the Belyaev fox domestication, where it was a fox fur farm, where the researchers took the young animals at a fixed age and simply reached into the cage and then observed their behavior. So some animals would try and attack the hand as it approached. Others would try and move away as much as possible. By selecting animals that had the weakest reaction to being approached by a human, in 5 generations, they turned foxes that were mostly very difficult to handle into ones that were similar in domestic dogs to domestic dogs in the behavior, that would actually come up to humans, climb all over them, lick them, and a whole bunch of other traits that go along with the domestication syndrome appeared, like floppy ears and multicolored coats. So yeah, 5 generations for beavers with, let's say, 2 generations per breeding cycle. And yeah, in 10 to 20 years, you could have beavers that are very easy for humans to interact with. Secondary traits that could be useful would be early maturity and larger litters to give more range for selection. Later on, you could also look at selecting lower interspecific aggression, beaver-on-beaver fights. This would allow individuals to create larger colonies with multiple breeding pairs in the same lodge, which might also be useful for interacting with humans. What are the long-term opportunities in a domestic beaver population? So the first option that comes to mind is a possible use as a controlled and sustainable source of beaver fur. This was the reason the animals were nearly driven to extinction, because they have extremely useful, warm, waterproof fur. And the kits could potentially be culled before they reach maturity if no new locations are available for them to create their own lodge and dam. And occasionally mature adult pairs could be culled and replaced as they age out. I think beavers live about 10 to 20 years. Another potentially interesting byproduct would be beaver teeth. So in pre-agricultural times, these have an extensive history for use in tools and weapons, as chisels and knives and scrapers, and they're even strong enough to shape flint. So their enamel is really remarkable. It's reinforced with iron nanowires. This is why beaver teeth kind of look rust-colored. And this makes them harder and more resistant than most other teeth that you'll find in any other animal. And they're also self-sharpening. Beaver meat was also highly favored in its original range. It's rich in fat and protein and would be preferred over other animals that were available. And finally, an unusual product is castoreum. This is a secretion that comes from the ventral sacs of mature beavers that is used in perfumery. It has all sorts of interesting vanilla kind of notes, and it's a very expensive product today. Just on the side, you could potentially selectively breed beavers to have improvements in any of these traits. So, the possibilities are wide open for this multi-purpose animal. But the real potential benefit here is in ecosystem services. This is probably the most unique feature of beavers. So their primary unique skill is their instinct to construct dams, and that changes the entire water flow and hydrology in an ecosystem. Beavers also clear trees and vegetation from the periphery of the dams that they construct, and this creates another unique habitat that can be used by other creatures. It can create conflicts with the cultivation of plants. Indigenous North Americans used to cultivate wild rice, which is very sensitive to water depth, so they typically had to drive beavers away from the places they were trying to grow wild rice. But there might be other opportunities for symbiosis between crops and beavers in the future once the beavers become easier to manage with human attention. So you could potentially rotate your beaver population between different watersheds, have an active colony that builds the dam and clears the surrounding vegetation, and then when you move those animals to a different dam far away, that creates an empty ecosystem with a window for cultivating crops in a very fertile and heavily watered ecosystem before the beavers cycle back after the harvest comes in. Now, beavers raised in isolation develop precise dam building skill sets without any parental training. So it seems to have a very defined genetic basis. Researchers found that the sound of running water triggers dam building instinct in the beavers, whereas if you have quiet water overflowing, they basically ignore it. So humans have the ability to create engineered overflow channels that are either silent or noisy that can influence the behavior of the beavers and help humans fine-tune the specifics of the system for their own needs. Beavers will relocate spontaneously from a lodge if the water levels get too low or the flow rate decreases too much. So again, this potentially could be used, but I think ideally, the animals would be more directly controlled in where they choose to locate from moment to moment. So one possibility is to breed out the lodge-making instinct in beavers and allow humans to build lodges for them that are safe and accessible both for the beavers and the humans, which would make management, such as culling surplus numbers, easier, and also allow humans to control their location in the environment, maybe help move them from lodge to lodge at fixed times in the years. Preliminary experiments with building artificial lodges has found that they increase predation risk, partly from the beavers being disoriented, partly because they don't have tight enough predator-proof water access. There's tunnels underwater that the beavers built so that they can get away from most other predators. It is worth noting that beavers readily accept human-built dams, and humans can take over or participate in the maintenance. Or humans can do the early construction, and then beavers can do the continual maintenance to keep the structure functional over time, saving a lot of labor in the long run. Now, what about beaver feeding behavior? So this provides another mechanism to reward tameness and creates opportunities for handling and assessment and management. And it also favors the improving condition and reproductive rate of desired traits in animals that are favored by humans. So beavers, primarily eat vegetation, and they are very efficient at fermenting cellulose. And the plant species that they tend to feed on varies a lot over the year. When available, they prefer soft and nitrogen-rich material over woody material. So particularly in summer, they eat a lot of aquatic water plants like water lilies and cattails and arrowheads. And this is more important for juveniles, probably a combination of them growing faster and also being more vulnerable to predation if they go out onto the land. They also eat terrestrial plants like grass and clover, and they'll even travel long distances for fruit if it is available. So maybe humans could provide high quality food to assist in their growth and reproduction. Around autumn, they shift to eating more bark, especially from sapling trees. And each beaver will harvest hundreds of trees per year and strip the bark. And they can travel up to 300 feet, about 100 meters from water. And beyond that, they'll even build canals to make it easier for dragging wood back to the lodge and their dam for construction. They can occasionally be limited by access to sodium and iodine in the ecosystem. And this is another point where humans could supplement. And in captivity, they particularly like sweet potato, carrot, and corn on the cob. So again, for semi-domesticated animals, being able to provision this food from humans gives us an opportunity to interact with them and manage their development. Now, the final possible use for domestic beavers, maybe further in the future when they're easier to handle, they have an incredible capacity for cutting timber, but they are limited in the maximum size of trees that they'll tackle and the hardness of the wood. This opens up a possibility of using beavers for landscape management in a way that few other creatures can do. Maybe goats, but they tend to nibble shoots repeatedly until trees die, but only up to a limited height, whereas beavers can actually fell trees that have gotten away from animals like goats. So humans could potentially guide the movement of beavers through the landscape to focus on particular locations for cutting. So if the beavers are trained to follow the humans and work around them, that could save the humans from having to make tools and do all of that work by hand. This could also tie into coppicing rotations for wood, particularly in a much bigger circle around a body of water where the beavers are centered. Humans could also potentially develop various ways of directing a beaver's attention to a target tree that it might not otherwise be inclined to cut down, possibly with like a paste that either has a nutrient like sodium that they are looking for, or who knows, maybe even castoreum could be redirected as a behavioral cue to attack a tree that humans want to bring down. Now, what's it like to live with beavers? They instinctively chew on any wood around them, and they construct and shift around any kind of wood that they can, and small objects that they can get their hands on. So there's some very cute videos of juvenile beavers in people's houses piling all of their toys up across a doorway to make a dam. So you could potentially build a house or a structure that has a cob or a mud brick or a rammed earth foundation, and then build the upper structure with wood to keep it out of range of the beavers if you don't want them modifying it over time. Bites from beavers can be serious. There's one recorded fatality of some poor person who bled out when a beaver bit a major artery. But most wild hand-raised beavers are very affectionate to their humans. They carry a risk of tularemia and giardia and a few other parasites, not that different from other animals, but living alongside them in the presence of standing water is a potential disease risk that needs to be managed. And if you did live in the same location as beavers beside a dam, that does carry some risk of flooding. So you might need a backup shelter to retreat to in the times of extra rainfall and flow. So putting all this together, let me paint a little picture of what beavers could be like in the not too distant future. I am experimenting with a voice-to-voice transformation program from 11 Labs that I think has a lot of potential in self-published fiction audiobooks. So bear with me while I have a play with this new tool.
When I turned 15, I walked into the village for the first time on my own to trade the beaver tooth knives I had made for credit in the market. I happened to run into a travelling trader, and he had a half-grown kit with him that he said was from a very rare type of beaver, all the way from Asia. Dad had been complaining that our lodge was becoming inbred, so thinking it would help, I traded the knives for the baby and headed home. Dad was furious when he found out. He yelled that I had traded all those knives for a useless beaver which could never breed with our Patagonian ones. When I started crying, he apologised and said that we could keep the kit as long as she pulled her weight, and named her Sorrow as a reminder of my mistake. The other beavers gave her a bit of a hard time to begin, but the hissing and the growling died down after a few weeks. Sorrow grew quickly that summer and became extra attached to me since the other beavers didn't like her so much. She would even follow me all the way to town, something the others were too afraid to do. Once she was strong enough, Sorrow joined in helping me bring wood to the kiln. My parents are potters, you see, so we use a lot of wood. After my great-grandparents built the dam and their house, they started digging in the clay pit and making pots and shingles for the nearby village. My job is to walk the beavers around the dam every year in a big circle. I coppice the trees, and I tie the bundles and drop them into the lake, and then the beavers swim them down to the spillway where Dad pulls them out to dry. After a few years, we were shocked when Sorrow became pregnant. Dad told me not to get my hopes up, and he was mostly right. 4 kits came out stillborn, but the last one, a little girl, was born alive, and she grew up faster and stronger than any other beaver any of us have ever seen. Dad said the hybrid might not be able to have babies on its own. That's why I lean to hope.
I hope you've enjoyed this first solo episode, diving into a topic I've wanted to research and share for a long time. If you like this kind of analysis, check out my book, Taming the Apocalypse. It includes a survey of the entire tree of life, from microbes all the way up to mammals, for overlooked domestication potential. And I'll be doing more of these episodes in the future, maybe once or twice a month, looking at animals, plants, microbes that have domestication potential, and other cultural experiments that I've been thinking about that would be interesting. So check that all out. The audiobook for Taming the Apocalypse is also available on Kobo or via a paid subscription to my Substack. So that's another option if you want to get through it without reading.